And good morning, church. It's good to see you here today, and it's good, I hope, for you to be here. Those of you online, we're thrilled that you could be with us today as well. It's a good day to worship the Lord, and we want to do it in spirit and in truth, and with as much enthusiasm as we possibly can. So, it's good to be together. Before we get started, there's just a few announcements of good news, really good things that are unfolding. First of all, it seems like all the people made it back from camp and survived. That's good. And we had good news from camp as well. We had a baptism with Ansley. We get being baptized earlier in the week. That's fantastic. I saw the pictures. What a winner for that, for two. Also in midweek, we had two young men go forward, a victory for sure, and concerned about their spiritual life. I appreciate the courage and the heart of Mason and James in doing that. That's a win. Camp is very powerful in that regard. And so there's some good things from camp. At the same time, in this past week, we've had a couple of families that met with the eldership and have wanted to place membership and be a part of our church family. What a win. Good news. So if I could ask Andy and Cindy Adams, if you all would mind standing up, please, if you don't mind, for just a second. Thank you very much. You can be seated now. I don't want to embarrass you, but we're thrilled that you could be with us. Look forward for you being here, and be sure to get a chance to go say hi to them. At the same time, John and Denisha Long, if you all would not mind standing up as well. We're thrilled that you could be here, and thank you very much. We don't mean to embarrass anybody, but you know, it's kind of exciting as our church family grows and we get the opportunity to add new people and to worship together and work together. It's fantastic. In addition to these news, you know, for some time we've been looking for to fill a position in the office, and it's not exactly the same as it used to be. This is a bookkeeping and a digital media position that we've been looking to fill, and we really appreciate all that sent in resumes and interviewed and such. Really, truly grateful for that. But this week, Tina Van Britsen has started to fill that position. And in next week's bulletin, just to be clear about it, we'll put some descriptors in there of what Tina's responsibilities are that are very specific now, and also what Randa's position is and how that's a little bit different. And hopefully that'll help you when you have a need in the office. You'll know exactly who to go to, and for what particular reason to go there. So that's pretty exciting as our church continues to grow as well. Looking forward to that. And finally, those of you that are going on the rafting and fellowship, the trip in July, please see me after services. We'll meet up here, and just a couple of details on that. All right, let's begin. Ostentatious is not modest. We've been spending a couple of weeks now talking about what it means to be modest. We began with the idea that modesty begins internally with what's inside your heart. And if you are going to be someone that is dignified for God, you're living for God, if you are going to be what He wants you to be, internally is where that is going to begin. It will express itself externally. We looked at Daniel as a fine example of upholding godly values and beliefs and being in an incredibly difficult situation as he was taken captive in exile by the Babylonians. But he had a lot of qualities about him that sometimes people wrestle with as they try to understand modesty, and that's why we used him as an example. A lot of times when people talk about modesty, they get ideas of drab, weak, frankly ugly, less than, at best average. Just someone that coast by and you wouldn't pay any attention to them. And that's what being modest means. But Daniel, none of those things. That's a different value system. Daniel was noted as being exceptionally smart, intellectually and wise. Exceptionally smart. The Bible describes him also as a handsome man. But the Bible describes him as a person who did not draw attention to himself, but he put attention on God. And in that, we find modesty. The internal values that he had in his dedication to God and his faith was expressed externally in the way he carried himself, using the talents and the abilities, intellectually, physically, whatever it was, to honor God. That's modesty. Don't have to be less than, but we do have to be self-controlled, and we do need to be disciplined, and we do need to be purposeful in the way that we live. That's modesty. We also talked about modesty of speech and being mindful of the way that you speak. Sometimes people have no regard for what they say or they do, and they speak in a way that's immodest. Maybe it's obvious things like vulgarities, and maybe it's obvious things like puffing themselves up, but our speech needs to be seasoned with grace, and our speech needs to be reflective of our inner faith in God, and in that, there is modesty. Today we're focusing on clothing. I know it's kind of built up to it. And I know when we talk about modesty, typically that's where the brain goes. Oh, well, they're going to talk about clothes. They're going to tell us how short our hemlines can and can't be and necklines and such. What if it's more than that, though, in our clothing? I mean, is there inappropriate hemlines? For sure, for sure. Am I here to tell you the exact length you need to cut your trousers and dresses and such? Not really. I can tell you what's wrong. You can figure that out. We will get to some principles that are going to get there for sure. And so that's pretty important to do, because even in that, even in the way we dress, and dress is certainly something that is expressive of internal values, at least it can be if you're deliberate about it, if you're disciplined in it. It's possible that the way that you dress expresses internal values. You see that all the time. Alan Bush, you know what sports team he's for, because he expresses it quite orangely out in the open. And that's a beautiful thing. The other day he was wearing orange, I was wearing orange, and someone said, man, you Tennessee fans. I said, my shirt's from Canada. Let's be clear, Canada. Those are beautiful Canadian mountains. And he pointed out there's beautiful mountains in Tennessee, not missing a beat. Yeah, your outer appearance can reflect some things. It may reflect your job. If you are out and someone sees a stethoscope around your neck, they're probably not going to assume you're a carpenter. If you are, please explain. Maybe there's a good reason. If you are walking around with a chainsaw and they assume that you're a doctor, please explain. Things are messy. It expresses a thing. And typically that just happens for sure. And sometimes there's a general world where it's really vague and hard to tell. But modesty should, in terms of dress, express internally our values for God. In fact, it should be very clear that we are godly people because of it. And it shouldn't express the question mark, well, maybe they are? Because if we're in the point of maybe they are, then definitely we need to do some self-reflection. And definitely we need to take responsibility to make it definitely they're godly people. But we need to do that within some parameters, because it's also possible to go too far. And that's where we're starting with the word ostentatious. What an absurd word, ostentatious. How often do you use that in daily language? And if you do use it in daily language, how do you think, man, is that too big of a word? Do I sound pretentious in using that word? Maybe. It's a fun word. Just the sound of it sounds fun. It's only 4 syllables. And while it is a bit absurd of a word, it's very humble in that it only gets you 12 points in Scrabble. That's it when you throw it out. So that's kind of funny. Interestingly, the word amazing gets you 19 points, which smaller word, but it does have that Z. It's semi-common. Sometimes you might hear it used, maybe all that. It does have all the vowels in it, A, E, I, O, U. And if you say ostentatiously, it also got that sometimes Y. What an absurd word. Do you know, even because of the size of the word, you can make 783 other words out of ostentatious, which is, of course, also ostentatious in its nature. I didn't count them. You can Google those things now, and I did. But it's also a thing, you know it when you see it. It's quite extreme in the presentation. Because if you dress ostentatiously, you're probably putting the focus on yourself. And it's a very clear one that the Bible talks about. Throwing in fun fact, if you do play Scrabble, this is the word that'll get you the strongest beginning. Muzhiks. It's a Russian peasant. It's possible to get 128 points off that first play. That's free of charge. Just throwing out there for you. Ostentatious, you know it when you see it. Man, a cat dressed like this, ostentatious, kind of funny. A grown man dressed like this coming to church, come on. What are you doing? A lady, that's fun, but where's its place, especially when you see the whole outfit? You kind of want to meet this person, don't you? But is that like a 10-minute meeting, or is it like an all-day meeting, or is it like, keep your distance? It's ostentatious. There might be a time and a place where this is appropriate, but every single day, all the time, what is this expressing? And it's interesting because when we talk about modesty and going too far and putting the emphasis on yourself, and that's when it gets dangerous and not God, she's covered head to toe, but it's possible that this is still immodest because the focus is in the wrong place. Biblically, there's passages that talk about this overdress thing, and let's read one. 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 8 through 10, and this is addressing specifically women, but to be sure, make no mistake about it, Men, women, young, old, anybody can be immodest. And I know sometimes this topic feels kind of gross and icky because sometimes it's only directed at the women and how terrible they are. But let's be clear, that's not what we're doing today. This is for everybody. How do you express what's internally your value for God, externally in your clothing? 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 8 through 10, Paul's writing to Timothy and addressing some issues of the particular time. Now, some scholars think that there were some values of the Greco-Roman family life that were being challenged at this time in the way that women would adorn themselves. And this would be an expression of sexual impropriety. And the way that they would dress would push that out there. It was so bad that even Greco-Roman secular world enacted legislation to curb this. And if you know anything about that world, that's pretty interesting. Because what did they have to pull back on? Well, certainly, if they thought it was pretty bad, given their worldly views on modesty and whatnot, Paul had to address this in the context of Timothy here. But the point is not that the women are wearing too little here, is that they're overdressing in a particular way that draws attention to a different set of values than what God would uphold. So, he says this, I desire therefore that the men pray everywhere, lifting up holy hands, without wrath and doubting. So first he's addressing men in the way that they pray, a godly practice. But he's also getting at the fact that the internal matters. If you're praying, doing a very godly thing, but your internal life is caught up in wrath and doubting, that's not the way to go. The external must match the internal and vice versa. Likewise, in a like manner also, that the women adorn themselves in modest apparel, with propriety and moderation, okay, key qualifiers, not with braided hair or gold or pearls or costly clothing, but which is proper for women professing godliness with good works. Now, sometimes this passage is taken and someone reads it and is like, oh man, if a woman braids her hair, sinner. If you're wearing gold, sinner. We can delineate that by looking at other passages in the Bible and say, let's get down to really what we're talking about here. Are there examples of women in the Bible that are of good character and noted as good character, and they also were beautiful and they also wore gold? Well, yeah, of course. And if that's the case, Rebecca, Genesis chapter 24, if you want to go ahead and look that, we'll be there in just a second. Of course. So if that's the case, there must be something more going on here because the Bible doesn't contradict itself, and there's the same sort of value in principle as that's pre-covenant with Israel in Genesis 24, and this is Jesus' covenant for sure, but the idea is exactly the same. And what is being expressed by the braids and the gold is the question. In Genesis chapter 24, when the servant was going out looking for Isaac a wife, and he comes across this woman, and in Genesis chapter 24, it's pretty plain that God blessed her with incredible physical beauty because the language is really direct on that matter. Verse 16, now the young woman was very beautiful to behold. Not just kind of pretty, see you buddy, not just that she was kind of pretty, but she was exceptionally beautiful to behold. God blessed her with that attractiveness. A virgin, and no man had known her. And she went down to the well, and she filled her pitcher, and she came up, and the servant ran up to meet her. Please let me drink a little water from your pitcher. And she said, drink, my lord. And she quickly let her pitcher down to her hand and gave him a drink. And when she had finished giving him a drink, she said, I will draw water for your camels also, until they have finished drinking. Then she quickly emptied her pitcher into the trough, ran back to the well to draw water, and drew for all his camels. And the man, wondering at her, remained silent so as to know whether the Lord had made his journey prosperous or not. This was an act of God, that God was going to find the wife and provide the wife for Isaac. And the servant was going to fulfill this, and he had things that he was looking for to know if this was the key detail. And verse 22, so it was when the camels had finished drinking, the man took a golden nose ring weighing half a shekel and 2 bracelets for her wrist weighing 10 shekels in gold, and said, whose daughter are you? Tell me, please, is there room in your father's house for us to lodge? Well, down later in the chapter, about verse 47, he says he put those, someone may read the beginning part and go like, what did he do with them? We put them on her. It was a signifier. She's a beautiful woman. She's a virgin, so she's virtuous in her character. She's very kind in what she's doing. She's offering to go above and beyond. And so she's being viewed as a beautiful woman, a wife, potential for Isaac, but a good person, even though she's wearing gold. So the gold in 1 Timothy chapter 2, not just gold for the sake of gold, is put that off. Gold's featured quite prominently in the Bible, so it's not that. The braided hair and the other things, examples as well. It's fitting a particular time, but it was immodest in what the women were doing because they were not showing propriety and they were not showing godliness. It conflicted with values. And Paul said it has no place here. So if your clothing and your dress and the way you attire yourself conflicts with godly values, there's a problem. Even if it's ostentatious and flamboyant, especially so as it draws attention to yourself. Master Bruce Lee of Kung Fu and many things, he gave this great quote, and I think it really ties this together. Showing off is the fool's idea of glory. Showing off is the fool's idea of glory. If you prance around with great pomp and circumstance and you think that's my glory, what a cheap life. There's an emptiness inside. The point of 1 Timothy chapter 2, 8 through 10 was that you should adorn yourself for things of great value, things of godliness, things of a godly character. We saw that in Rebekah in Genesis chapter 24. We'll see this in other places as well momentarily. The virtuous woman of Proverbs chapter 31, and certainly Daniel had it in Daniel chapter 1 and the chapters following. It was godliness. And the godliness from an internal thing expressed externally in the clothing made all the difference in the world. People want specifics sometimes, but we'll get to that in a second. You go to the scripture reading that was just read for us, Zach read for us. Therefore, as the elect of God, this is what you do as a Christian, Paul's writing in Colossians. Therefore, as the elect of God, holy and beloved, here's what you put on. This is the most important thing to put on. Tender mercies, kindness, humility, meekness, long-suffering, bearing with one another, forgiving one another. He also says to put on love. Now, you stop and think about how that will affect the value of what you wear. What if this makes up who you are? What if these godly characteristics make up who you are? What if this is your internal identity? And I mean, you know it for sure. You work on this and you give that the attention. There's a lot of people in our world that give a lot of attention to the way they dress, and that's fine to a degree, but what if your main priority was these things? What kind of tender mercy do I put on in my life? And do I express out in the world by the way I give to people? And what kind of kindness do I put on and I clothe myself in? Is it obvious that I'm a kind person? Is it so clear that when I go out and the way I interact and people see me, not for show, but pointing towards God, do they see the kindness? Or is it covered up by something else? And what about humility? And what about meekness? And what about long-suffering? Are these things evident in the way that I express myself in the world? And do I put them on in such a way that it's undeniable? It's so clear. It's so obvious that you are a Christian. It's so obvious that you're dressed in these things. You're a Christian. And if you are dressed in these things, how would that impact your physical clothes? Meaning, do your clothes express that as well? Do you have that kind of a mindset about the way you dress? Clothes express a lot. They're symbols, that's for sure. That's for sure. Even at an early age, you can put pictures on a page and ask kids to guess what these people do. Sometimes it's pretty obvious. You put them in a spacesuit and a helmet, astronaut, sure. Put him in a suit, could be a million different things for sure, from good guys to bad guys, depending if you're more of Godfather or if you're a banker or what you are. There's variety in it for sure. But sometimes it's not so good overall. I was talking to my sister about this earlier in the week, and we noticed a phenomenon. She works at a school, and you go to the mall and you see the way people dress, and over the last 10, 20 years, it seems there's been a stronger push for the way that young people dress, with their clothes hanging down, showing their undergarments, or they dress in a way that's more reflective of a lady of the night than a lady proper. And I thought, isn't it so interesting that it's gone in that particular way, and we're trying to find a place where we're saying, yeah, but that's okay. Well, maybe we feel okay about it, but what value does that evoke? Is that showing that you are clothed in tender mercies, kindness, humility, meekness, long-suffering, a willingness to bear one another's burdens? Does that demonstrate that you've put on love? Is it obvious that you're a Christian from that? Or does that inhibit the ability for someone to recognize Christ in your life? And you're like, wow, that's so shallow. How dare you judge me by what I'm wearing? But clothing is an expression. It's a symbol. It just is. It just is. And there's a responsibility. And the great aspect of Christianity is that we have a responsibility in the way that we express ourselves in the world. Philippians chapter 2, we read last Sunday night, and we talked about that in terms of responsibility in the way that we reflect ourselves in the world. When you esteem others better than yourself, when you put the needs of others above yourself, Christianity, and then having the mind of Christ, is about being aware of the people around you and how you affect them. It's aware of how you affect them, even in the way that you wear your clothes. And you can say, well, I dress for me. I dress for me. And if you're a Christian, I say, stop right there. You dress for God first. We dress for God first. We dress for others, and we dress for ourselves. We got to put that in the right order, especially if we are putting on tender mercies and kindness and humility, and we're putting on meekness and long-suffering, and we're putting on love, and we're putting on the things that express godliness. We dress for God first, the effect on others second, and for ourselves last. There's got to be a priority in that. And if we do that, we're probably going to end up in the right parameters to please God in the way that we dress, with modesty. Not ostentatiously, and not in a skimpy way, but in a godly way. Now that's hard to put a finger on sometimes. But like the word ostentatious, as I said earlier, you kind of know it when you see it. It changes over time. But we know some things. Biblically, they're like, well, what do they dress like in the Bible? That's a good question. And in the Old Testament, man, it's tough. I got to be honest. We know Adam and Eve were clothed by God with coats of skins. We know that. What exactly that was, that's kind of tough. The Hebrews often didn't depict people in their artwork, and so that would have been a clue. Other cultures did, so we can get to a point where we can kind of figure that out a little bit. You could trace the word that's used for coats there, and you could find it hundreds of years later in the way it was used at that particular time. However, Jewish sources suggest that it's quite different than a Greek thing would be, so it's a little vague there. But we do know God wanted them covered, and there's certain parts of the body, keep them covered. We know that. And there's other passages that deal with shame in that. But what we do have is other cultures that would depict Asiatic cultures. This is a hieroglyphic from a tomb. The Egyptians happen to be pretty good at depicting things with some level of accuracy. And this, not to bore you too much, is Transjordanian people that are coming to do trade with the Egyptians. And I'll do a little bit more of a close-up. You can see that their dress is a little dramatic for sure, but they're trying to put a good impression with the Egyptians. Egypt was very, very powerful at the time. Good trade would be good economy. And you can see that there's a variety in the way that they dress. Some from the shoulder down to below the knee, but there would be one shoulder that would be usually done because the fabric would drape in one way. Others would have sort of a kilt-like appearance to them, all pretty common. This also corresponds when you go into the tombs of the pharaohs and see what their slave classes dressed like, which is interesting to us because biblically the Hebrew nation was slave class in Egypt for well over 400 years. And so they would have dressed in a typical format for the slave classes in this, which mostly would have been a kilt-like thing. And depicting a particular station in life, you can note that the Pharaoh dressed in quite ornate costume as well, for us a costume, but he had a kilt, and over time it became a pleated kilt, and adding more fabric. Typically this would have been linen, white linen, because they didn't have the technology to dye the linen. Today you can buy a multitude of colors of linen for sure, but that would have been what they looked like. And so we know that's what they dressed like when they were Egyptian slaves. It would be befitting the class they were in that, and it would have been befitting the geography of that. But it wouldn't always remain the same, would it? I mean, they came out of that. And the interesting thing about this is when they came out of slavery and God delivered them in the Exodus, that he did give some specific commands about dress to them, but to the high priest and the priest class. To the rest of the people, it wasn't quite as specific. And there was a coat and there was a tunic for the high priest, and you can read the details of that in Exodus chapter 28. It's also interesting to note in Exodus chapter 28, for the high priest, who would be the high priest for life and serve in the temple, of course he had very specific garments to wear, and they were holy garments, and he had to cleanse himself in wearing them. It does not note his footwear, which I think is pretty interesting in and of itself. But to the priests and the high priest, specifics. But they're coming out of Egyptian slavery, so that would have been reflected, and there's not a lot of information on that. We do know God did care about their clothes because he provided for them. Deuteronomy chapter 29 and verse 5, it makes mention of the fact that God allowed their clothes not to wear down, nor their sandals. He provided for them. Perhaps that was in a miraculous way, and perhaps they inherited the previous generation's clothes, because in Deuteronomy chapter 29 verse 5, he's speaking to the people that had been wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. They would have been youngins at some point in that, because it was only the people less than 20 years old that made it that far, aside from Joshua and Caleb. But God provided for them. He cared about some things. Things change over time, and they would. Eventually, more Greek and Roman dress would have been expected, and you've seen that depicted in many of the first century things. But we understand this in our culture, don't we, how things change? This is a picture of my ancestors. I've shown you before. Obviously, very happy people, incredibly joyous people. I'm scared of one of them, frankly. I am. But it's this one that I think... No, it's the bottom. No, she's super nice. She's super nice. I'm sure, right? Never met her. But her dress, at this particular time, modest, incredibly modest. Her dress came up to her neck, and she's got this stuff, and it's nothing so fancy that she's trying to draw incredible attention to herself. It would be befitting the time and the geography for where she was. It would have been very modest. If you wore that to church today, would that be modest? Because everyone's eyes would be looking at you. And in decency, and I'm sure no one here would gossip or say anything negative at all, I'm sure. Best not. It's my family. You're drawing attention to yourself. You would have so much focus on yourself, because it is not what's common today. Not even close. It's not that different from this. In some regard, it's very different, but it draws a lot of attention to the self. And is the attention on God, or is the attention on the self? And why? Why are you expressing in such a way that focuses on this? Is that not pride? Does that not get into those things that do not profess godliness? Lust of the flesh, lust of the eyes, the pride of life. It would speak more to that, even though covered head to toe, it's a problem. This today, what a beautiful family. Modest. But so it's a t-shirt, but they're covered, but it's modest. Not a lot of attention on them. I like the simplicity of this for sure. And if this family comes in, I think we would greet them, and I think we'd be very, very friendly to them, but I don't think anyone would even take note of the way that they dress, because it's modest. Maybe those t-shirts and shirts of exceptional quality cotton, and you just wouldn't even know, but they're not flashing that at all. Believe me, such shirts exist. I found out there's a store that's selling $1,000 t-shirts. I don't think he's wearing it, but maybe $1,000 for a t-shirt. Do I want one? Kinda. One of our members suggests I use it to wipe my hands at Buffalo Wild Wings. Okay, sure. I'm not wearing that shirt. You'll never know. Anyway, that's modest. But how the times have changed. They do, based on geography and culture and whatnot. And there's nothing sinful about this. It's modest. It's through your actions, and it's through your practices, and it's through your meekness and your tender mercies and your long suffering and your love that you will evoke this. But do not let your wardrobe impede that. If you are dressing in a way that suggests a lifestyle quite contrary to God, male, female, young or old, there's a problem in that. If you are trying to look more like a criminal, perhaps, you're not professing godliness. That would be immodest. Steer clear of that. Men or women, either way. If you're trying to look like an outlaw, perhaps, it's pretty common some places where people are from, why would you do that? if you're trying to appear in a way that would make people think that you're scary or frightening or hateful or destructive, you can't do that and not think about inhibiting your Christianity and your faith. And yes, if you are dressed in a way that your hemline is so short that it reflects something that is other than Christ, yeah, that's a problem as well. And you would have to ask yourself, why am I doing that? Am I trying to please God or am I trying to please the world? One of those comes with tremendous blessings, and the other comes with great problems. I think of passages that we read kind of often, and I think in this context of modesty, they strike a little differently. Romans chapter 8, verses 5 and 6. It says, "For those who live according to the flesh set their mind on the things of the flesh." Do we do that in the way that we dress? "But those who, according to the Spirit, set their minds on the things of the Spirit. For to set the mind on the flesh is death, but to set the mind on the Spirit is life and peace." Philippians 4:8 says, "Finally, brothers, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is commendable, if there's any excellence, if there's anything worthy of praise, think about these things." How about also express those things, even in the way that you dress? Matthew 6:33, "Seek ye first the kingdom of God." We do that in the way that we dress. The great warning would be about dressing in a way that would evoke 1 John chapter 2, verses 15 through 17, where it talks about those things that are going to impede you in your faith. "Do not love the world or the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh," does the way that you dress evoke the lust of the flesh? If so, you need to do something about that. For your soul, and perhaps the ones around you as well, take that responsibility. The lust of the eyes. Does the way that you dress evoke the lust of the eyes? If so, that's contrary to godliness and contrary to God. Take responsibility for your own soul and the ones around you that you may affect. And the pride of life. Does the way you dress, your clothes, your sensibilities in that regard, reflect the pride of life? If so, consider, why are you doing that? And change in a way for the sake of your own soul and those around you. We are not without responsibility to one another, but also we are responsible for ourselves as well. So we have to bear those two things. And so here's the way I would ask you to do that in a couple of different ways. One, if you know that your dress affects someone in the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eye, the pride of life, please stop. You know. You might get defensive and say that's their business, that's their problem. But if you know it's a problem and you are creating a temptation and you know that it's not helpful at all and doesn't reflect godliness, male, female, either way, both young and old, it all applies. If you don't know but you find out, and it kind of strikes you, and you feel the temptation to get defensive on that, I would challenge you to think of all those passages in the Bible, especially the ones where Paul talks about not even eating meat around people, because he doesn't want to be a stumbling block. He takes on that personal responsibility in Corinthians that he doesn't want to be a stumbling block to anyone's soul in any way whatsoever, and he's willing to make changes, and he's willing to make a sacrifice and restrict his life. Even though he has a lot of freedom to do things, he's going to make that restriction for the benefit of others. Man, that's a high view, high maturity in spirituality. Something to aspire to, because he recognizes that your actions aren't for you alone, and this applies in this as well. Your dress isn't for you alone, and if it does impede someone else and creates a stumbling block, take responsibility. That's Christianity. That's evoking godliness. That's meekness is what that is. That's humility is what that is. That's love is what that is. And in that Colossians 3 passage, that's bearing one another's burdens is what that is. That's being Christ-like. That's modesty. That's modesty. So yeah, I don't want to spend the time telling you that you should wear a suit or not wear a suit, or you should wear a dress or not wear a dress, and the hemlines and all that business. But I am going to say biblically, you need to be very mindful of what you're doing and ask yourself, is it for God first? First. Does it evoke Christianity? Does it evoke and make sure it's very clear who you are? There's a wide scope of what that could be for a multitude of situations and what's appropriate. But ask yourself that. Second of all, how does it affect the people around you? How does it affect the people around you? Take responsibility for that. And I don't mean just in mindset of lust alone. That's typically where this goes, and with good reason. But also think about the other emotions you might evoke in people. Take responsibility. Do you create anger? Are you chasing anger with the way that you dress? Are you trying to troll people? Can you imagine if Alan would wear his Tennessee thing in the midst of Wildcat country at Rupp Arena just for the sake of doing it? Maybe that's fun or okay. But what if you knew that someone had strong views on something and you wore something to purposely oppose what they believed in? Is that keeping peace or is that creating chaos? Be very careful about those things. Even in this, modesty. Modesty. Be conscious of those things. And finally, take joy in what you wear. Express it. You can wear things for yourself. You and I may not have the same style whatsoever. There's probably a lot of crossover, and that's okay. Some of you do dress a little bit eccentrically, and I say that as a compliment, and I respect it. And oftentimes you do it without trying to draw attention to yourself. You just like what you like. And as long as God's okay with it, great. And just because it's not what the person next to you wears, that's okay too. We don't all need to be in the same uniforms. That's a little culty. We have no business in that. You're wearing black robes and white Nikes, that's dangerous. Stop. We're allowed to have a lot of variety. Enjoy it. God's blessed us with a lot of choice and variety. Enjoy it. The topic of modesty does not have to be one where it's all about being drab or ugly or boring or paring yourself down. There were beautiful people in the Bible, and there were mediocre people in the Bible, and there's some that had great intellectual capacities, and there's some that wore quite fanciful clothes like the kings and such. But the really faithful and good ones always pointed towards God, no matter what they had, no matter at all. And that's the same thing for us today. So in terms of being modest, put God first. Even if you have to change your wardrobe, even if it requires a little bit more effort, you've never thought about the way it impacts other people, take that responsibility. That's being Christ-like, and enjoy it for yourself. We'll close up there. Today is an invitation. Maybe these are some things that you've never thought of before, and maybe, frankly, you've so dove into it, you're like, oh man, the way I dress might be insanely immodest. Or maybe you find the self that you've encountered that before, and you found these emotions of defensiveness, and you've been angry at people, like, how dare they suggest that I'm immodest? How dare they? Maybe you have been treated bad in that, and maybe not. And maybe you're holding on to this anger and peace, and it's pushing and not giving you any peace, and you're pushing away from people in that. Maybe you need to repent of that. Maybe you need to let go of that and come to live at peace by doing what's right in terms of modesty. This is a time when we offer the invitation for people to consider their spiritual life, especially if you're a Christian in the way that you're living. And it's a time to consider whether or not you need repentance or to come back. But if you're not a Christian, man, what an opportunity. I'm so grateful we have a new sister in Christ this week. I'm so grateful we have young men that are willing to consider their hearts in a relationship with God, and they're not scared to go publicly and make a statement about that because it matters too much. Your soul is so precious. You matter tremendously, and whatever we can do to help you to be at peace with God and have a right relationship with Him and to put on Christ and to live in a way that evokes that faith and you truly shine as a light, man, we will do whatever we can to help you. Whatever we can do. If there is a way we can serve you, please let us know as we stand and as we sing.